All right, welcome everyone. Good evening, and thank you for joining us for this program. My name is Sharon Berry, for those of you that don't know me, and I'm a co-founder of the Hannah Ida Urman Foundation, which is named after my grandmother who was killed in Auschwitz. Joining us this evening are people that signed up. I'm not sure everyone is with us, but we are recording this. Are people from across the United States and also from Australia, Brazil, Canada, Germany, Israel, and Poland. We selected this format of a webinar since there were so many people that registered versus a Zoom meeting where you have 120 little windows on the screen. So in a webinar format, that means that you can see us, but we can't see you. At any time during the program, you can submit questions in the chat box, which is, if you can't see it, if you mouse over, navigate to the bottom of the screen, you'll see the chat box option. Questions will be answered after the presentation as time permits. We would appreciate that the chat all function is only used for questions so that Pat will, after the program, will easily be able to navigate through the questions and answer those. If we don't have time to get to your question, please feel free to email your question to info@hannahfound. And that email address was in the confirmation email that you did receive. Also attached to the confirmation was a program brochure that we included some information about the foundation, and it also an upcoming program, and it also contains a bibliography that Pat compiled for this program. I have known our presenter this evening for decades, although until recent years, we were unaware of our shared history. When I knew Pat years ago, she was an accomplished litigator and trial attorney. Pat has published short fiction and award-winning poetry. She's also the founder of Ready Readers, which is a nonprofit that inspires low-income children to become readers. And now I would like to introduce our guest, Pat Simons, who will tell us about the Nazi money trail.
I'd like to welcome everyone and to thank you, Sharon, for inviting me to speak tonight. As Sharon said, we've known each other many years, but it wasn't really until 2013 when I realized that she was connected to Ben Fainer, who was a Holocaust survivor. He and I had both written books about the same time. Mine was based on the story of my dad and my uncle, who had been forced out of Germany in 1933 because Nazis were coming to their home to kill them. Sharon's father, Ben, was just a kid when he was taken to a concentration camp. He survived the hell of several of them before finally being freed. I met him because we had both written books about the same time. He had written one about his life, and we were both volunteering as speakers at the St. Louis Holocaust Museum. When Ben died, Sharon and her sister Sandy started this foundation in order to continue Ben's commitment to education about the Holocaust in that period. When I was doing the research for my book, I started wondering how the Nazis, a small extremist group of anti-Semites, ever got enough money to grow into a state within a state, to undermine the German democracy, to wage World War II, and to murder 2 out of every 3 Jews living in Europe, as well as millions of other people they considered unfit to live. I learned that a few years before Hitler took power, some prominent banks created a new international bank. They called the Bank for International Settlements. This bank originally had one purpose, but that purpose became futile because reparations were basically forgiven by the United States. The bank actually worked to enable bankers from both Allied and Axis countries to work with each other, even during World War II. This bank, which is called the International Bank, the Bank for International Settlements, or BIS, turned out to be instrumental in facilitating deals between the Nazis and citizens of both Allied and Axis countries throughout World War II. 4 prominent Nazis on its board during the war were later convicted of crimes against humanity. Hitler's finance minister, Schacht, helped start BIS. And then in 1933, when Hitler took power, Schacht and the German Reichsbank, the main German bank, came up with a scheme to get more money. They issued glorified IOUs at high interest rates. By continually issuing this funny money and continuously raising the interest rate amounts they promised, Germany was able to pay for millions of dollars worth of goods and services totally on credit. Many investors ended up never getting repaid. I learned that other money came from banks, including several American banks, that stole assets of their Jewish and other anti-Nazi customers by closing their bank accounts and giving the Nazis their money. That practice went on both before and during World War II. I also learned that our government and American businesses invested heavily in Germany's fledgling democracy and economic recovery right after World War I. In fact, between 1924 and 1930, American banks sold American investors over $1 billion worth of bonds in German enterprises. Most of the bonds were issued by a very few German cartels, and many investors ended up making nothing. But the American banks who facilitated these deals made $50 million in profit. And the few huge German companies that got the investors' money strengthened their own locks on their cartels and their industries. But of all the things I learned, the thing that most amazed me about the financing of the Nazis and the preparation of the Nazis for war, the thing that most amazed me was the invaluable role that American companies played in enabling the Nazis to rearm and make war again. Both the Nazi armaments minister and executives of major German industries acknowledged that the kind of war the Nazis had waged would have been impossible without American help. I'll be more specific about that help in a few minutes. Well, so you might think the war ended almost 76 years ago. Why bring this up again? We can't go back and undo anything. And the people that run the companies today aren't the ones who did it then. Why should we care now? Well, we probably all know the answer to that because we know all too well that past action informs present conduct. What big business did before, they have done since then, and they still do. And they always will, unless we check their conduct. With the internet now and social media, we may actually have the means to do more than we used to be able to do, to find out what's going on and force companies that are doing things to damage our people and our planets to acknowledge what they're doing and stop what they're doing and not do what they're doing just to enhance their bottom line. Many of America's largest corporations helped make World War II and the Holocaust possible. Very few have acknowledged any of their complicity. But the sad truth is, as I said, that without the infusion of American capital, American know-how, and American raw materials, World War II, if it had happened, would certainly have been very different. It would not have been the deadliest war in human history. And the Holocaust, if it happened, would not have systematically slaughtered 11 million people, including 6 million Jews. The story of American involvement with the Nazis begins with Henry Ford, an American success story and a worldwide hero. In 1919, Ford gave a newspaper interview in which he said, the Jews had caused all the wars in history. And when the Nazi Party was nothing but a small group of anti-Semitic, nationalistic ex-soldiers and aristocrats, Ford started praising what they were doing. He told family members that Hitler was right to try to get rid of Germany's Jews because they were the biggest problem everywhere, and he could think of no one more worthy of his support. In 1920, Sharon, if you can put on the Henry Ford slide. In 1920, Henry Ford bought a Detroit newspaper. That newspaper published anti-Semitic articles for 91 consecutive weeks. The articles were mostly based on an old anti-Semitic novel called Protocols of the Elders of Zion, in which Jewish bankers were plotting to take over the world. As soon as he started publishing these articles, both the New York Times and the London Times began investigating. They published long pieces discrediting this book that he was relying on as a libelous and plagiarized piece of fiction. But Ford ignored that. Instead, he compiled the most popular articles into a 4-part book, which he called The International Jew, and which he published as a series of 4 pamphlets over a period of 18 months, and then distributed worldwide. Ford sent the book to Ford dealers to sell or give customers. He sent the book to schools and libraries all over the world. It was translated into 16 languages. 6 editions of this book existed in Germany by the year 1922. In 1921, when Ford first began admiring Hitler, World War II had just ended. Germany was in turmoil. And as I said, the Nazis at that stage consisted of a small, mostly ignored group with its own fledgling militia, but there were a lot of roving militias in that day. But by 1922, a year later, the Nazis had an office, a staff, a functioning organization, and their own newspaper. That same year, a Berlin newspaper reported that Hitler was telling visitors he had Ford's financial support. In 1923, Hitler now had enough money to attempt a coup during which he and his key men and hundreds of paramilitary followers tried to overthrow the shaky democratic government. He was arrested and sentenced to 5 years in prison, but the speeches he made during his trial got him sympathy and publicity and attracted his first significant German business backer, a steel magnate and industrialist named Fritz Thyssen. Hitler ended up spending less than a year in jail, where he had a comfortable room, few restrictions, and a lot of amenities. Even was allowed to have a birthday party and unlimited visitors. During his prison time, he wrote Mein Kampf, My Struggle, which laid out the Nazis' platform. In this manifesto, Hitler called Henry Ford, quote, a great man, close quote, and, quote, my inspiration, close quote. He hung a portrait of Henry Ford in his office, and he displayed his book there. Ford also kept a photo of Hitler in his American office. The next year, 1924, one of Hitler's men went to Detroit to ask for money. Ford publicly refused. But before that public refusal, Ford privately told a friend he was looking forward to seeing Hitler's man and how happy he was to be able to support Hitler. That very year, 1924, Ford Motors established a sales office in Germany, and the next year, 1925, Ford set up a wholly owned German subsidiary, Ford Werke. Ford's German subsidiary made money in Nazi Germany, but what mattered much more was the qualitative support he and his company gave the Nazis. That extended through the 1930s and continued even after the US declared war in 1942. In 1938, Hitler honored Ford with a medal symbolizing Germany's highest award for civilians. Ford kept the medal. Because of his fame, influence, and popularity, Henry Ford inspired other prominent businessmen, as well as celebrities and ordinary people, to embrace and spout anti-Semitic lies. After the war ended, former Nazi soldiers said it was Henry Ford, not Hitler, who first taught them to hate Jews when they were growing up in the 1920s. Here's what one Nazi leader named Baldur von Schirach said, quote, "I read and became anti-Semitic. In those days, this book made a deep impression on my friends and myself because we saw in Henry Ford the representative of success, also the exponent of a progressive social policy. In the poverty-stricken and wretched Germany of the time, youth looked toward America, and apart from the great benefactor Herbert Hoover, it was Ford who to us represented America," close quote. In 1938, Germany attacked Poland, starting World War II. The US declared war on Germany in 1941. And in 1942, Congress passed a law forbidding trading with the enemy. Our government required American companies in Germany to report their business interests and the values they placed on them. The American government required the same thing again in 1945 at the end of the war. You are looking at the cover of a 1945 publication, United States War Department pamphlet. This was actually first published in 1942 and then 1945. Lists about 120 American companies that reported their German interests at those times. There were more companies, some did not report at all. For example, Fred Koch, the father of Charles and David Koch, built a major oil refinery that Hitler personally approved. That company does not appear in this list. Let's have a look at some of those who did report. As you will see, many large corporations had multiple subsidiaries and offices and factories. American companies owned most or all the stock in these subsidiaries, hired their key people, and controlled their subsidiaries' operations. You'll see the first page here, 394, Appendix C. There are several that are highlighted. What we've done is highlight for you the companies whose names you might recognize. I'm not going to go into great detail about these companies, but I will go into detail about some that were the most egregious in their complicity as we move along. But you can see the highlighted pages of the first two pages there. You know, Burroughs Adding Machine, I'm sure, at American Express. Companies whose German subsidiaries kept operating during the war often say they had no control over what they did then. But look at Corn Products Refining Company, the top one on the left-hand corner of the next page that you've got. That was a major company. The major shareholder was actually Standard Oil. It was also the major shareholder in many of them. E.I. DuPont was another one with major complicity. Go ahead, Sharon. You do the next slide, Sharon. You'll see on this page Ford Motor Company. You'll see General Motors Acceptance Corporation, which is the financing arm. You'll see General Motors Corporation, which was a major offender that I'll talk about in some detail in a minute. You'll see Gillette Safety Razors. You'll see Gulf Oil and Hugo Stinnes, that was a German man. He had a corporation and industries named after him. And take a look at the number of subsidiaries. The United States government actually confiscated those assets and the assets of his because they were in America, some of them. Go ahead. Here's Hugo Stinitz again. You see all the business interests he has. Next page, you'll see one of the worst offenders, which I'll talk about in detail, IBM. You'll also see General Electric, another offender that I'll talk about. International Harvester, I'm sure you recognize. And International, I can't tell, that shoe company, International Telephone and Telegraph was a major offender as well. There it is, and you see all the subsidiaries it had. On the next page, you'll see Kraft Cheese. You may recognize Lowe's. Lowe's was the owner of Metro Goldwyn Mayer. On the next page, you'll see several more you may recognize. Paramount Pictures, Pete Marwick, Philip Morris, Standard Oil, of course. The Stanley Works, that's Stanley Tools, and even Steinway and Son, piano company. The US did forbid trading with the enemy after 1941, and the US did seize the assets of some large companies. One or two actually left. Woolworth was one that left. But in most cases, the German government just appointed custodians who managed the German businesses that were owned by American corporations. These custodians were often men who had already been hired by the American parent company and were already managing the German subsidiary. And you ask, who got the profits they made during the war? According to a 2020 publication of the US National Archives and Records Administration, the US government found no hard evidence that the Nazi government confiscated the German subsidiaries' profits during the war. Moreover, when the war ended, the appointed German custodians returned most of the parent company's stock and assets, and the American parent companies publicly resumed control of their foreign subsidiaries. Next slide. This slide shows you the top 20 American companies in Germany and the dollars that they reported to the government that they invested. I rounded the numbers and I made a column here that says equivalents in 2020 dollars, so you can get some idea of the amount that they say they were worth. Standard Oil, you can see, claims it lost a couple of $1 million during the war. In a minute, I'll tell you why that probably isn't correct. General Motors says they lost some money. Woolworths, I told you, pulled out. International Securities, which you may not recognize, is number 4. If you look at number 6, that's the same group of companies. It's Singer. And in one case, it looks like they made some money, or reported they did, and in the other, it looks like they lost a little. Now, ITT is interesting because they reported that they were worth $307 million in 1942, or the equivalent of that. They didn't report anything in 1945. And I'm not sure what, if anything, was ever done about any of that, people that didn't report. This Hugo Stinnes was the one I told you was seized. You can see it was worth quite a lot. And Corn Products Refining Company interestingly, as I told you, Standard owned most of that, Standard Oil. They didn't report in 1945, but they were worth $226 million. That one corn products refining companies, one Standard affiliated company. There are other top 10 lists of profitability that you can find, but this list I thought was important because they declared what their stock was worth. As you can see, and as I told you, some of them did report that the values of their subsidiaries went down, but they didn't really lose much, if they lost anything at all. And here's why. First, in 1942, when the US said it was unlawful to trade with Germany, parent corporations were allowed to declare the total value of their German subsidiaries to be a tax loss. Doing that reduced their taxable income, which certainly didn't hurt their bottom line. But their subsidiaries were really only a paper loss, not a real loss. Most of them kept right on making money during the war. And after the war, the parent companies got the money. As I already told you, our own government found no evidence that Germany took those wartime profits. Third, as much as they invested in pre-World War II Germany, the majority of these giant US corporations' eggs weren't stuck in just a German basket. Some of them were monopolies, and many of them had multiple interests in facilities and companies all over the world. Fourth, the same companies that supplied the Nazis also supplied the United States and our allies with what we needed to wage war. And they made enormous profits from doing that. And finally, the American parent corporations also received millions of dollars in compensation from us, the US government, for Allied bomb damage done to their European properties. As you saw on this particular list, General Motors ranked number 2 among all American corporate earners. I'd like to tell you more about that now. During the 1930s, Hitler's military machine was actually General Motors' largest customer in the world. In 1929, GM bought the German auto company Opel and turned it into a GM German subsidiary. This is Hitler at an auto exhibition. He loved cars and he loved auto shows. And this is him standing there talking with Opel executives. Opel GM provided the Nazi war machine with technical information and supplies they used to make the Blitz truck, which was the main German truck that occupied Europe. GM also developed rocket technology, built engines for German bombers, and made landmines and torpedo detonators. Ethyl Gasoline Corporation, which GM and Standard Oil both owned, also supplied the Nazis with tetraethyl lead, built military manufacturing facilities for the Nazis in the 1930s, and secretly stockpiled millions of dollars in aviation gas for them. Opel had a workforce of 27,000 by 1938 and was one of Germany's leading employers. There's no doubt about the value of GM's contribution to Germany's ability to wage state-of-the-art war. In fact, after the war, the Nazis' armaments chief, Albert Speer, said Germany simply could not have attempted the Blitzkrieg without the technology GM had provided. Like Ford's subsidiary, GM's Opel subsidiary knowingly used forced labor taken from concentration camps during the war. Prisoners of war and non-Jews were paid a paltry wage, and of course, Jews were not paid. A few months after giving Henry Ford its highest civilian award in 1938, the Nazis also gave a medal to GM through its overseas director, James Mooney. Big businesses often say they did nothing to support Hitler after the US declared war, but we know that isn't accurate. In GM's case, at least twice after the US banned trading with Germany, Mr. Moody went to Germany and assisted the Nazis in converting a GM auto plant into a plant that would make engines for the bomber that Germany ended up using most of all during World War II. The American board of directors of Opel never changed during the war. American GM continued doing business in other Axis countries as well. And as was true in the case of Ford, the Opel subsidiary hung on to the American General Motors stock and gave it back after the war, and GM resumed full control of the subsidiary at that time. In 1945, GM's stock in Opel would have been valued in today's dollars at about $760 million. But as much as the auto industry supported Hitler, the oil business and suppliers of raw materials and metals did more. That became a big problem for the United States when we declared war on Germany. They had shipped so much to Germany that the United States ended up with major shortages of metals we needed in order to win the war. To understand what happened, I need to take you back a little. In the 1920s, Germany, as I told you, was war-torn and shaky. High unemployment, a growing communist party, labor unrest, and roving bands of paramilitary men. It was also very far from self-sufficient. It didn't have much of anything in the way of oil or other raw materials. What it did have was a large and very, very sophisticated chemical and dye industry. But it did not have the technology to modernize and rearm its military. It wasn't even supposed to have a military under the World War I peace treaty called the Versailles Treaty. But the US had not signed the Versailles Treaty, and American companies did have everything the Germans didn't have, especially patents and technology with which to produce the latest synthetics of oil, gasoline, rubber, textiles, and nitrates. US companies also had abundant raw materials like oil, aluminum, and tungsten that Germany would need in order to make state-of-the-art weapons. Go to the next slide, Sharon. In 1925, about 12 men from the big German chemical and dye companies got together with American bankers and businessmen, including the man I told you about before, Fritz Thyssen, the industrialist who supported Hitler. They formed a company that they called IG Farben. The name IG Farben stood for words meaning community of interests. Originally, there were even 4 German Jews on this board. They were forced out once the Nazis came into power. The 1925 forming board formed a managing board of directors, and that consisted of both German and American bankers and industrialists who also helped to capitalize IG Farben. Among them were the Rockefeller family, which owned Standard Oil, Prescott Bush and his father-in-law, Herbert Walker, Averill and Roland Harriman, and the German industrialist Fritz Thyssen. These men not only helped capitalize IG Farben, but they created cartels and a banking system to funnel money back and forth between Nazi Germany and the US industries that fed the Nazi regime. Not only did they use BIS, the international bank I told you about earlier, but they set up other banks, including one set up by Bush and Walker in New York called Union Banking Corporation. Fritz Thyssen was that bank's biggest customer. Thyssen owned other banks. He owned one in Holland that funneled money back and forth to and from the new American bank in Germany. In 1942, the US forced Union Banking Company to stop working with Tyson and the Nazis and seized his assets. But some bank assets were also returned to the original investors after the war. Before we leave this slide, I just want you to take a look at it for a minute. IG Farben was enormous. It grew to be the fourth largest employer in Germany and doubled its size in just a few years, thanks to American capital. I'll tell you more about that too. In 1932, which was the year before Hitler took power, top Nazis, bankers, and industrialists held a series of meetings. According to Fritz Tyson, many of them signed a petition asking for Hitler to be appointed chancellor. He was law and order candidate and against the communists. And so were our business people, and so were the German business people. Big business also contributed money to the Nazis at that point in time. Standard Oil gave the Nazi Party a donation of $2 million in 1932. In 1933, right after Hitler took power, IG Farben donated a large sum to the Nazi Party, and the Nazi government then became synonymous with IG Farben's interests. This was no secret to big American corporations who were already connected to them. In 12 years, between 1925 and 1937, Farben doubled in size. It was the fourth largest overall industry in the world after GM, US Steel, and Standard Oil. This was thanks in large part to Wall Street and multiple deals with the cartels that were formed by Standard Oil, GM, DuPont, Union Carbide, Alcoa, Dow Chemical, their many US interests, and other US companies. IG Farben is infamous today because after the war, it was found guilty of crimes against humanity. Several German lower echelon people and a couple of executives were punished. No Americans involved with IG Farben were ever indicted. The crimes it was found guilty of were crimes against humanity, especially at Auschwitz, where Farben had its own concentration camp. Farben owned 42.5% of Dagesh, which was a German company that produced Zyklon B, the gas that Germans used to kill the people in Auschwitz. The main ingredient of that gas was prussic acid, which had long been used as a disinfectant. But its toxicity made it a key ingredient of mustard gas in World War I, and the gas used to execute prisoners in American gas chambers, which interested Hitler greatly, and the gas used to murder about 1.1 million people at Auschwitz. IG Farben made a lot of money from selling Zyklon B to the SS and the German army. And of course, the more Farben profited, the more its American stakeholders profited. Who were these stakeholders? This slide shows you the American IG, or the subsidiary. Aniline is what they changed their name to. So it says American IG Aniline Directors 1930. Within 5 years of its start, IG Farben established an American subsidiary. The board members included Edsel Ford, Henry's son, Walter Teagle of Standard Oil and Federal Reserve Bank of New York, H.A. Metz from the Bank of Manhattan, C.E. Mitchell, who was the director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York and part of National City Bank, Paul Warburg from the Federal Reserve and the Bank of Manhattan, and W.E. Weiss from Sterling Products, which was a U.S. pharmaceutical company that owned the patent at that time for Bayer aspirins. Among other things, American IG Farben owned half of an Alcoa magnesium company and half of a company called General Aniline, a chemical dye and synthetics manufacturer. From 1933 to 1939, Farben's American subsidiary lied to the SEC by filing reports that said either it, quote, had no parent, close quote, or, quote, did not know if it had a parent company. Then in 1939, the American Farben merged with one of the companies it partly owned, and it changed its name to General Aniline. Farben's American subsidiary, when it did that in 1939, was worth $11 million, mostly in Standard Oil stock. In today's dollars, that would be $207 million. August von Neeren, a German executive of IG Farben, acknowledged the invaluable role of American companies when he said that Hitler's style of war would have been, quote, impossible, close quote, if Americans hadn't, quote, presented us with the production plans complete with their know-how, close quote. I told you about IG Farben because you needed that background to grasp Standard Oil's pivotal role in creating the Nazi war machine. Not only did they help capitalize Farben, but probably Standard Oil did more than any other American company to enable the Nazis to make World War II the deadly conflict that it was. The Rockefeller family owned most of the shares in Standard Oil. Standard Oil owned the next biggest share in IG Farben, the second largest share. Standard Oil also controlled numerous subsidiaries, including German American Petroleum, a Standard Oil subsidiary whose board chair was part of an elite SS extortionist group called Circle of Friends. To get the SS protection of their German business interests, big American companies bribed them. A Standard Oil German subsidiary contributed substantial sums to the SS in 1943 and 1944. In 1941, there was a congressional investigation of Standard Oil because of all the monopolies and cartels it had. That investigation revealed that since 1929, it had had a secret contract with IG Farben. In that contract, Standard Oil had promised it would not compete with Farben in the world chemical industry. And in return, Farben agreed not to compete with Standard Oil in the international oil business, except within Germany. The two also agreed they would share trade secrets when their interests coincided. So throughout the 1930s, Standard Oil provided IG Farben with technical information to manufacture butyl rubber, which was another rubber they needed. The technology Standard provided enabled Germany to develop tires for heavy war equipment and tetraethyl-leaded gasoline for airplane fuel. Standard built refineries in Germany to produce high-octane aviation fuel for the German Air Force. Standard also assigned Farben its patents for a superior method of making explosives. It even helped Farben pay for the raw materials and the chemicals it needed to manufacture these products. It did that by discounting the prices it charged Germany and forfeiting bonds it had posted to ensure Farben's payment to other suppliers of raw materials. Standard Oil was also a traitor to the United States. The letter you see there has been retyped so you can see what I'm talking about. It's a letter from 5th Corps Area Officer of the Corps Area Commander of the War Department in Washington, dated 1941. This is before we declared war. But during the time we were trying to help Britain fend off the Nazis by sending it some badly needed petroleum products. this letter says, as you see, is that Standard Oil was shipping fuel from under a Panamanian registry instead of American registry. And it went to from Aruba to the in the Dutch West Indies to Tenerife and then the Canary Islands. There, it diverted about 20% of it to the present German government by basically by allowing their submarines, which were fueling, to refuel. About 6 of the ships operating on this route, it says, are reputed to be manned mainly by Nazi officers. Seamen have reported to the informant that they've seen submarines in the immediate vicinity of the Canary Islands and have learned that these submarines are refueling there. The informant also stated that Standard Oil Company has not lost any ships to date by torpedoing, as have other companies whose ships operate to other ports. Now, I will tell you that later that year, there was a torpedoing of one of the Standard ships. I don't know if there was a miscommunication between the Nazis and Standard Oil or what. Even after the war started in Europe, Standard Oil tried to leverage its connections with the Nazis by pushing the United States to let it sell certain Hungarian assets to the Nazis. The United States refused because this would have further helped Germany's plan to dominate Europe. In 1939, the US began sending Britain supplies it needed to defend against Germany. But as I said, a lot of that was deferred. And a lot of fuel that was supposed to be going to Britain ended up going to Germany on Nazi ships. Next slide. From 1933 on, Standard Oil worked hard to get American public support for the Nazi regime. Standard Oil hired the most prominent New York advertising agency, Ivy League, to spin the Reich in a favorable light and to advertise and promote Standard Oil's joint ventures with the Nazi government as if they were patriotic acts. This publicity, combined with the anti-Semitic rhetoric of prominent people, certainly didn't hurt the Nazi cause in the United States, where pro-Nazi heroes like Ford and Charles Lindbergh and radio celebrities like the priest, Father Coughlin, regularly spread hatred of Jews, admiration of Hitler's Germany, and support for American isolationism. Pro-Nazi support groups in our country drew thousands of people to rallies and marches. But if Standard Oil was the company that did the most to create the Nazi war machine, IBM was the company that did the most to create the Holocaust. Let me set that stage now. When the American stock market crashed in 1929, so did Germany's economy. This was now the second time, remember, in a decade. The new scary economic situation was again compounded by high unemployment, the popularity of the Communist Party, and labor unrest. The Nazi Party promised law and order and the restoration of German pride and power, and it gained popular support in the elections to the German parliament, the Reichstag. US businesses approved of the Nazis' anti-communism and its emphasis on law and order. Nazi ideas about Aryan racial superiority did not faze most American business leaders. Actually, scientists in the US were studying theories about eugenics or racial superiority at the same time. The Carnegie Institute started funding research into eugenics and experiments on people who didn't know they were being experimented on early in the 20th century. Companies run by Standard Oil's Rockefeller family, as late as 1952, supported the American Eugenics Society, whose mission, as stated, was to stop the spread of non-white people in America. One of Hitler's first objectives in Aryanizing Germany was to expel all the Jews. But to do that, he needed to know who and where they were. That was not obvious, since they made up less than 1% of the entire German population, since most of them were white, and since most of them were assimilated and not at all religious. How to identify German Jews? Can we see the next slide, please? Enter IBM. You'll see two pictures here. One is an IBM punch card machine. It's called a holograph machine. And the second one is a punch card. And what it stands for is written there for you in yellow ink, or in yellow. Of all the American companies involved in Nazi Germany, IBM takes first prize for complicity in connection with the Holocaust. IBM produced and provided the Nazis with custom-made punch cards to help Hitler's government find the Jews. It helped take official census, plumb official records, including church records. And the punch cards of people with Jewish ancestry were marked with a Jew, Jewish, whether or not the individual involved even self-identified as Jewish. IBM also built, leased, installed, and serviced its holograph equipment in hundreds of locations, including inside the vast German system all over Europe of concentration camps. IBM trained and sent its servicemen to service its machines and to train the Nazis how to use them wherever they were located. IBM's technology and equipment enabled the Nazis to identify, locate, and transport Jews to ghettos and concentration camps. Its systems and equipment were used to round up Jews in occupied countries, to determine when and how many to transport to specific locations, to determine which rail lines were free and when, to determine occupancy in detention areas, and even to help schedule forced labor details and executions. When prisoners entered camps, those selected to work were registered and tattooed with an IBM number that corresponded to their specific punch card. That way, their whereabouts could easily be verified. Here you'll see two pictures. One of Thomas Watson, who of course got a Nazi medal. He was the CEO of IBM. And the second one is the tattoo that belonged to an Auschwitz survivor. Sharon Berry was actually able to find his identity out, and it's written there under the tattoo. Many more US corporations contributed in essential ways to rearming and enabling Germany to fight World War II. Here briefly are a few more examples. General Electric. From 1929 to 1941, General Electric and the German company Krupp monopolized all US-German trade in tungsten carbide, which is an essential machine tool metal. Their price fixing agreements resulted in GE having a virtual lock on this product. GE charged the US far more for this product than it charged Germany. And it supplied so much of it to Germany so cheaply that Germany developed a machine tool industry far superior to that of the United States during the 1930s. Alcoa aluminum. Alcoa supplied so much aluminum to the Nazis that Germany was able to make over 60% more products from aluminum than the US was able to make during the 1930s. This was another raw material essential for the production of military equipment and weaponry, as well as many other products. The US had a significant aluminum shortage when World War II began. In 1940, when the US published a list of 20 major items critical to US national defense, 14 of these items were produced by American companies involved in major arrangements with IG Farben and other German businesses. ITT. In 1933, Sosthenes Bennis, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing his name, the CEO of ITT, was the first American businessman to meet with Hitler. He and ITT remained instrumental throughout the 1930s and throughout the war. In return for permitting continuing American control during the war, Ben increased the payments he was already making to the Gestapo through that SS protection racket I told you about, Circle of Friends. In 1943 and 1944, ITT's German subsidiaries contributed close to 1/4 of all the bribes the SS received. Through at least 3 German subsidiaries, ITT built bombers and radar equipment. During World War II, ITT continued providing patents which facilitated Nazi economic penetration of conquered countries. ITT's German subsidiary, shown here, Focke-Wulf, made fighter planes for the Nazis. During the war, ITT was Focke-Wulf's single largest shareholder. It owned 25%. The remaining shares were personally split even by Sosthenes Bennis and a German man. ITT also owned an interest in a German company that made radar and related equipment for Germany during the war. ITT never reported these interests to the US government. In 1962, the US gave ITT $26 million in damages to compensate it for its share of loss in a bombed aircraft plant. In today's dollars, that would be $226 million. Chase Manhattan Bank, JP Morgan, and Citibank. The New York bank connected to Bush, Walker, Tyson wasn't the only American bank that supported Hitler's government. These 3 banks not only encouraged investments in Germany's funny money, which allowed the government to buy what it needed without paying for it, but they also seized the bank accounts of Jews and gave the money to the Nazis. Some of these seizures happened before the war and some during it. Chase defied the US during the war by moving funds of American customers who supported the Nazis from the US into German banks, and by accepting funds from Germany on behalf of Americans who were invested in Germany. Dow Chemical and DuPont. Irénée DuPont was a firm believer in Nazi racial theory, and DuPont provided the Nazis with licenses in acrylics, nitrogenous products, nylon, and processes for making a very important military product, Buna rubber. We also know that Dow Chemical, the sole producer of magnesium in the United States, purposely limited its production in order to be part of other contracts with IG Farben. As a result, German magnesium output in 1939 was over 5 times that of the US. This is a DuPont operation with forced labor during the war that you're looking at. How much did the American government know about American business involvement in rebuilding and rearming Germany? More than enough. It was no secret that the Farben cartel was infused with American capital and that American industrialists were involved in helping Germany rearm. Farben never made a secret of anything it was doing. The only thing US companies did not know was that Germany would soon be at war with the US. They were so interconnected that they thought and promoted the idea that America would remain neutral if war came. There were some Americans living in Germany in the 1930s who were sounding alarms. One of them was our ambassador, William Dodd. Why, Dodd asked Roosevelt, did over 100 major American companies have big contracts in Germany? Why were the DuPonts and International Harvester helping Hitler's IG Farben with the armaments business? Why had Standard Oil sent Hitler $2 million in December 1933? And why was Standard Oil and its subsidiaries making $500,000 a year helping IG Farben produce synthetic fuels? Why did American airplane companies have secret deals with the German company, Krupp? Why was such an enormous amount of business being done by German subsidiaries of American corporations? He told Roosevelt the activities of American companies are, quote, complicating things and adding to war dangers, close quote. Dodd never got answers to his questions. He, in fact, was recalled after asking too many questions and upsetting too many apple carts among the prominent politicians and businessmen. World War II killed an estimated 70 to 85 million people as a result of fighting, from injuries, illness, and other war-related causes. 11 million died in Nazi camps during the Holocaust. Would that war have happened without American capital and business involvement? Some say it would have happened anyway, although, as I previously mentioned, the Nazis themselves said they couldn't have invaded other countries without American technology. They couldn't have made this war the way it was without our help. Only a few American companies had patents and know-how to produce the synthetic rubber fuel and other materials Germany needed. And Germany could have done precious little without American exports of raw materials. World War II, if it had happened, would have been much different if we hadn't given Germany the money, the materials, and the know-how it lacked. Would the Holocaust have happened anyway? Well, before 1941, Hitler's plan was to expel all the Jews. About half of them left. But in 1938, most of the rest of the world refused to take Jewish immigrants. And soon Germany found itself controlling countries with Jewish populations. Poland alone had about 3 million Jews. So in 1941, Germany came up with its final solution to kill every Jewish man, woman, and child in Europe. They succeeded in murdering 2/3. Could they have done that without IBM? I don't think so. Without IBM, the Nazis would have had a much harder time locating, identifying, transporting, and systematically killing the 6 million Jews and other 5 million people they tortured or starved or murdered. Well, so what about today? Like the 3 totemic monkeys, most American corporations that did business with the Nazis say they heard no evil, saw no evil, and spoke no evil. At the very least, they ought to acknowledge and carefully analyze what their predecessors did. So far, they haven't done very much. Watson gave back his German medal, but IBM has never publicly acknowledged or apologized for anything. GM hired a pro-business historian to review some records, and they contributed a few $1,000,000 to a fund to compensate the descendants of slave laborers. But GM has never apologized or acknowledged what it did either. Ford did publicly apologize and did publicly denounce anti-Semitism, and even made Henry apologize, which he did by saying that in the future, he would be a, quote, friend to the Jewish race, close quote. A strange apology indeed. Ford Motor Company also paid a researcher to look into their records, and he produced a widely quoted report praising Ford's transparency and minimizing the company's involvement with the Nazis. Specifically, he pointed out that Ford's German operation made less money than a lot of the other companies. To me, that is dispositive of nothing. Ford Motors also publicly pledged some money for research and compensation for forced laborers. But Ford claims it had no idea that its German subsidiary was using forced laborers, even though the American parent company was still in control when it happened. I also question Ford's show of transparency because it is at odds with its most recent behavior. Just last year, 2020, there was a Holocaust exhibit that Ford sponsored at the US National Archives. There was absolutely no mention of Henry Ford or of Ford Motors' role in building the military vehicles for Hitler's war machine. It has been over 75 years, but questions are still being asked and not being answered, and they will be asked until every company that did business with the Nazis answers them. American companies owe that to themselves, to those who suffered and died while they lined their pockets, and to us who depend on them and still invest in them. We are the stakeholders in our future and our planet. Without demanding more transparency and without imposing checks on their conduct today, big corporations will never take a hard look at what they do. They will pay lip service to social responsibility, but that will be all. For individuals like you and me, it's frustrating, but there are a few things we can do. One thing is boycotting products that hurt their bottom line. That can work. It did in the 1930s when people boycotted Ford Motors and lawsuits were filed for libel against the company. That's what resulted in Henry Ford making his strange apology. And that's what resulted in an end, finally, to his anti-Semitic newspaper. We can also pay more attention to projects that corporations announce and ask questions about them if we have concerns. Investment clubs can be a good vehicle for that because they involve groups of people that are investing, not just one. It's virtually impossible these days to buy a mutual fund without ending up owning shares in whatever the fund buys. But we can make investments in funds that own companies with real commitments to social responsibility. And if we do buy stock in a single company, there really is no reason we can't investigate first. Finally, we can use current resources, including technology and social media, to raise awareness of exploitative corporate conduct, because for all its problems, social media has helped profile problematic corporate conduct, and widespread dissemination of a company's behavior can lead to change. I would like to thank you again for attending this webinar, and again to thank Sharon Berry and her sister Sandy and the Hannah Ida Urman Foundation for its efforts. If you would like to review the source material for this presentation, a list is included with the brochure you were emailed recently, or you can email the foundation. The link is also provided for you there. Thank you again. I will take a look at the questions that you've asked in the next few minutes and come back and try to answer them for you.
me a second here to find my, get things laid out here. While Pat's looking at the questions, I would just want to share a little bit of information about our family. The last picture, of course, was of my father. My dad was not afraid to die. He was afraid, however, that his and other stories would be forgotten. My father and 4 generations of his family were from Bedzin, Poland. In 1939, Bedzin's population was approximately 50,000 people, and 1/2 of the town observed Judaism. Bedzin happens to be located about 25 miles north of the town now known as Auschwitz. During World War II, Hitler's forces killed my father's mother, his 3 siblings, and hundreds of his extended family members. The image of my grandmother Hannah standing in a shower that was retooled for mass murder, holding an infant in her arms and a young child clutching each leg, gasping for air as the poison gas filled the chamber, haunts me. What my father suffered and the family he lost was not a conversation in our home as I was growing up. It was not until my dad shared his story with the Shoah Foundation in 1995 that he began sharing his story, and I began to learn about the missteps of humanity resulting in the Holocaust. It is difficult to fathom that so many US companies were involved in facilitating the murder of our family and tens of millions of other people, and that many of these companies remain exempt from criminal and moral responsibility. It is also a sad irony that the US armed forces were fighting an enemy in a war their own country funded. Pat, are you okay with the chat box?
Yes, and I can answer a couple of questions if
Okay.
you're ready, Sharon.
Go ahead, Pat. Thank you.
So a question is, do I suggest that companies associated with German American Jews intentionally invested in subsidiaries in Germany, which aided Nazis and Nazi anti-Semitism, and then specifically Lowe's and Steinway? I can't tell you specifically about who owned these companies, but I can tell you that companies that did have Jewish people in them did in fact do that. The movie companies actually, MGM, for example, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, accommodated the Nazis early on, particularly by removing things they thought were conflicting with their Aryanization program, that conflicted with their own philosophies, so as not to offend them and so as to continue having a market for their movies. As I also mentioned, even IG Farben had Jewish people invested in it and on their founding board until the late 1930s. There were even some Jewish people in Germany, not very many, that supported a lot of what the Nazis wanted to do. This was, of course, before 1941, when the Nazis decided to exterminate all of the Jewish people. Another question is whether I found any American companies with ties to some textile factories in Warsaw that were taken. And the answer to that is I didn't look at textile companies in textile factories in Poland, so I'm sorry, I can't answer that for you. Henry Ford's book, when was it translated? It was translated throughout the 1920s, all over the world. There were 16 different languages it was translated into. It was in German schools and libraries when the kids that became Nazi military were growing up. I don't think there were any other questions unless someone has any now. You feel free to ask them. Someone wrote, and this is interesting, the same sort of thing is going on now. US signs Paris Climate Agreement. Since then, large banks have given trillions of dollars to financing fossil fuel companies destroying the world's environment. There's a link that this person gives to stopthemoneypipeline.com. Now, the oil companies have been consistently like that. And I see the question about the textile companies saying, with a clarification, were there American textile companies who worked with commandeered textile companies in Nazi-occupied countries? I don't know that answer. I didn't research that. This is an interesting question. He says, it is clearer than ever that this country could have followed the Nazi lead and joined the Axis. Your thoughts? You know, most people in this country did not agree with the Nazis and their philosophy at all, and didn't want to follow it. There was a pretty hefty group like there is today that's very nationalistic. And that seems to veer toward a desire for autocracy or totalitarianism. But I do not think that the majority of the American population at all would have gone with the Axis. No, I don't. I think that there were American companies that were very much trying to keep us out of the war and keep us isolationist. And that one of their very strong reasons for doing that, the main one probably, was money.
There's some other questions.
This person says, I have heard that the New York Times was reluctant to share what it knew about what was happening in Nazi Germany. Can you share anything you know about that? I do know that the New York Times from time to time would publish information about what was happening, and that it wasn't unknown to the administration, the FDR and to his people, not unknown at all. Bear in mind, we were in the middle of the Great Depression here, and most Americans were very focused on staying alive and getting their rations. Not that that's an excuse, but it's an explanation of sorts. The New York Times probably could have done quite a bit more than it did. A lot of the articles they published were not given prominence, but to say they were reluctant to share what they knew, I don't think that's necessarily fair. I wouldn't have any evidence of that. Somebody says, are you writing a book on your research? The answer is no. I did that once. It was hard enough. Has it been possible to track where money moved within Germany and occupied countries, particularly with their investments in South America to fund the rat lines? Oh, it would be interesting to know the answer to that. I don't know. I haven't done that, and I haven't done any research on that. It's an interesting topic. I suggest to the questioners that they should do that. It would be interesting. A lot of Nazis did go to South America. Weirdly enough, a lot of Jewish Germans ended up in South America and in Mexico also when they were running away before the war started. Yes, as someone said, thank you for reminding us that the financial underpinnings of war are so relevant. I would say they are the reason for most wars. And see if there's anything else that I can answer.
Someone asked a question about for reviewing. So we did record the webinar, and I will circulate it to everyone that registered. Well, I'll post it on YouTube and circulate that link.
Well, thank you all again for coming tonight. It was my honor to share what I've learned with you. And I hope that it leads you to do a little bit more exploration of what we can do to maybe thwart some of these things in the future.
Thank you, Pat, and thank you everyone for attending. Our next program will be in May, right around V as in Victory Day, when I and my sister Sandy will talk with Richard Friedman, who is the son of Israel Friedman from Brooklyn, New York, who was the first person my father spoke to when he was liberated outside of Buchenwald in 1945. So thank you very much. If you have any further questions, don't hesitate to email us. Have a good night. Thank you.